Well, it was a wild first two games of the NLDS. And my goodness, I don't know if we feel good about our teams, bad about our teams, even about our teams, but the Mets and Phillies have put on a heck of a show. We're talking about it on today's episode.
You are Locked On Phillies, your daily Philadelphia Phillies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
See, this is funny because Ryan Finkelstein of Locked On Mets, who joins us today, he hosted the preview of the games the Phillies hosted. And now I'm hosting the preview of the games the Mets hosted. But whatever the case may be, the first two games of the NLDS are in the books. And we have a heck of an episode for you. I'm Connor Thomas, the host of Locked On Phillies. As I said, Ryan of Locked On Mets is with us. And we had a preview of the first two games. Now as the series shifts, we're going to look into what's going to happen potentially in the next two games. Our big takeaway so far, what we saw in the first two games. I do want to remind you, we're both part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Please make sure you're rating and reviewing wherever you consume your podcasts and subscribe to the YouTube for both Locked On Phillies and Locked On Mets. And today's episode is brought to you by Booking.com, Booking.yeah. So if you're planning on going up to New York, if you're a Phillies fan, or if this series does somehow go 5, which I think we're both rooting for and not at the same time because of the stress level it'll put on us. If you're looking to come down here from New York and stay in Philly, the right stay can make you a fan of any city, even your baseball rivals. Book today on Booking.com, the official accommodation partner of Major League Baseball. Get the Booking.com app today. Ryan, was that as stressful of first two games for you as it was for me, man, and pretty much everybody else watching this series?
You know what? I'll be honest. While it was stressful, don't get me wrong, the Mets have been playing sort of facing elimination for so long that just the fact that they've had a longer series to play with here has made me a little bit less stressed. Like the stress level was at an all-time high in that game 3 of the wild card round when the Mets went down. That's where I was super sad, super depressed, ready to give up. And then Alonso hit that home run to bring me back in. For this series so far, it's been great baseball games. And I think because the Mets had game 1 in hand as well, watching game 2 and seeing that game slip from the Mets, I was more just able to appreciate the fact that we're getting great baseball. And like you said, getting to a game 5 in this series, well, I think both teams would love it to not get there if they were the one in favor and they won the next 2 games. It sort of feels like this is a series that probably should go the distance. And that just means we're going to have a lot of big moments coming up.
No, 100%. So let's jump right into the first two games. We're going to do bigger takeaways as far as how they affect the series a little bit later on in the episode. But game 1, the Mets see Zach Wheeler at his absolute best. They stare him down. They don't give in themselves. And you have the major comeback as soon as you get to the bullpen. Was that a continuation of game 3 of the wild card series against the Brewers? Is that just who this team is? Can you talk about what it was like because I don't know if I can voice how I felt at the end of that game without saying words that we can't say on the podcast. Can you talk about what was it like to watch that comeback against the Phillies in game 1? And then what turned into a blowout with how you guys handled the Phillies bullpen?
Well, the Mets had the most comeback victories this year. And so to me, it's a continuation of what we've seen. And I don't know why. I go back to a game that probably happened in July. Mets versus Pirates. And Aroldis Chapman was looking really good that day, and he was throwing 102 miles per hour with consistency, and the Mets somehow found a way to beat him. They've had that knack this year to be able to get on a bullpen after they get the starter out of the game. And I think the strategy was pretty clear from the Mets. Just get Zach Wheeler out of there. And those 4 walks, I mean, Zach Wheeler, 1 hit, 9 strikeouts, but 4 walks. The walks are sort of the reason the Mets win that game because if Wheeler could go through 8 innings, I think the Phillies win that game 1. Instead, the Mets get into the bullpen. And I think a big storyline for this series, which we'll talk about as we continue on here, I think both of these teams have some real concerns with their bullpen right now. I don't think there's either team really has even 1 or 2 arms that they wholeheartedly trust right now, which is going to give us some amazing finishes as we've gotten these first 2 games where it has been those late innings with the lead changes and dramatic swings of momentum here. So, yeah, I think that's going to be a story that's going to keep coming up. But in that game 1, the Mets, they won that game by getting into the bullpen, even in the 8th inning, because that's when they exploded.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it's a weird thing because the Phillies bullpen has been so good this year. We're going to talk about that in takeaways. But really, the story from the Phillies side is Zach Wheeler was what you expected him to be, and Kyle Schwarber was who you expected him to be to start the game. And then the combination of Kodai Senga and David Peterson and everybody else pretty much on the roster that throws a baseball for the Mets gets you to a spot where you shut down this Phillies offense. It was just kind of a weird feel, almost like that series against the Diamondbacks last year in the NLCS, where the Phillies dropped 2 games at home against a team they felt they should have beaten. Well, it just carried over to the offense being anemic once again at home in the postseason, which is weird for a team in the Phillies that had the best home record in all of baseball this year. So that was certainly a situation where the Mets had to be feeling awesome about their chances. You steal game 1. It's exactly how the Phillies have beaten the Braves the past 2 years. It's exactly what we talked about in our crossover episode on Friday that we both posted up on Saturday about you steal game 1, the complexion of the series changes. And then it looked like you guys were seconds away from stealing game 2. And then you were seconds away from stealing game 2 again and again. And the Phillies were. That was your first reaction to that game? That was an instant classic, because that's all I could think once everything actually ended. But it's easy to say from the Phillies' perspective when they end up with a win in that game.
No, it was. You know, if you were watching the series from a Mets perspective through the first almost 6 innings of that second game, it was looking like it was going to be a short series. Luis Severino was at, I think, 64 pitches through 5 innings and looking like a frontline starter. He looked great. If Severino gets through that part of the lineup with Bryce Harper and Nick Castellanos without any problems, gets through that inning, he might go out and get a 7th inning for the Mets, and all of a sudden they only need 6 outs out of that bullpen. Maybe the Mets are up 2-0 in this series. But Bryce Harper gets a fastball that he can handle, crushes it, completely changes the game, gets the bank back in it. Castellanos then ties the game. It's a whole new ball game. But I think you look at the Mets, Brandon Nimmo, right after that, after watching Lindor and Vientos have some pretty ugly at-bats striking out in that 7th inning, Nimmo gets into a hitter's count, gets a pitch he can handle, it drives it out. I feel like there's a lot of guys in this series where, as you're watching, and this is what playoff baseball is, you're seeing these relievers trying to avoid throwing a strike, trying to avoid having to come into the zone against these tough hitters. But once they do have to come into the zone, the hitters are making them pay every time. And I think we're seeing that on both sides. We saw Mark Vientos with that big home run as well. So, yeah, I think you have 2 lineups that are particularly locked in, and I think should be the rest of the way. So it's going to be really interesting to see which pitchers step up and counteract that. But, yeah, that was an instant classic down the stretch to see the Phillies go up, Mets go up, Phillies go up again, Mets tie it. And it was one of those games where whoever batted last was going to win, and the Phillies obviously got the chance to bat last and walk it off.
Yeah, and that'll change in games 3 and 4 as the Phillies and Mets shift up to Citi Field. Can I ask you something real quick? Because I want to talk about the Phillies in game 2 and the way that they came back. And I'm sure people who are tuning into this for my thought on that want to hear. But who the bleep is Mark Vientos? Like, I know he's had a year where he's looked good and he's a good young player, and we saw all the stats during the TV broadcast of youngest player to do this and youngest player to do that. And a friend of mine on the radio was comparing him to Jeremy Pena of the Astros and what he did against the Phillies in the World Series of 2022, where it's just this young player on an absolute heater that goes off. Can you talk about this guy? Because I don't think Phillies fans truly have an appreciation for who he is as a baseball player. Well, we do now, but coming into this series, I don't think we did.
Well, just to stir things up for the Phillies fans listening, who Mark Vientos is a better hitter than Alec Bohm. That's who Mark Vientos is. Look, you look at the stats this year, and I think the Jeremy Pena comp in some respects makes sense as far as the kind of out of nowhere guy that's delivering in October. But if you watch Vientos this year, you look at like OPS, WRC plus. This guy was putting up better numbers, or numbers that were on par with Jose Ramirez. He had the best OPS on the Mets, if I'm not mistaken. He obviously wasn't a qualified hitter because he didn't end up getting a full-time role until near the end of May. But Mark Vientos, for those of you who aren't aware of his story, he is or was a bat-first prospect that never had a position. And Brett Beatty was always given the opportunities ahead of him at third base. Beatty wasn't hitting. Vientos got a shot and has hit the whole way through this year. He is probably their best source of power. I'm saying that over Pete Alonso this season, 27 home runs and significantly less at bats than Alonso had. Mark Vientos is a guy, and he's clearly not fazed by the moment. So, yeah, I think he'll continue to be a big factor for the Mets down the stretch and for years to come.
Yeah, you see the regular season numbers, and they're impressive. And then you think about the postseason for a player that young, and you wonder if it translates. And my goodness, has it translated? But the Phillies have a couple guys with incredible postseason numbers themselves. And a huge part of that comeback, you talked about the Bryce Harper home run. He's unbelievable, and what he can do for this team to get them going. Nick Castellanos, after saying these blanking people and getting caught on that, talking about the Philadelphia fans, then ends up having the walk-off hit, a home run following Bryce Harper. He finishes the game 3 for 5. It was just kind of a wild game with so much to break down. And the crazy thing about it is you got to wipe it and get ready to play another huge playoff game tomorrow. I almost said night, but tomorrow evening with another one of those early games, a 5:08 p.m. first pitch up in Queens. So we're going to talk about our biggest takeaways of the series so far. And then later on, we're going to get into what potentially happens in New York as we continue today's episode. But first, let's talk about Arena Club, because for most of us that like collecting cards, the idea of spending $2,000 or more on something like a Luka Doncic or an Ellie De La Cruz or Patrick Mahomes rookie card, it just isn't in the cards. I'm not going to drop that much money on a card, no matter how much you love it. We don't have scratch like that, or not everybody does. But I love collecting. I know Ryan loves collecting. I know we love the baseball cards are just kind of, if you're a baseball fan, baseball cards are inherent to who you are as a baseball fan, especially like the time we grew up in. And that time ain't gone. Thanks to slab packs from arenaclub.com. Now it's possible to score gem mints for a fraction of their retail price. Every card that I just listed there, Luka, Ellie, Mahomes, well, they were real possible cards that came out of slab packs in Arena Club slab pack drops last week. So Arena Club is the only repack that provides real value, a complete view of all possible cards, and clear hit rates for each one. So you got to go ahead and check them out. And right now, you can get 10% off your first slab pack or card purchase by going to arenaclub.com/lockedonMLB and use code LockedOnMLB. That's arenaclub.com/LockedOnMLB. Code LockedOnMLB. You'll get 10% off your first purchase. Save even more on what could be the greatest card pull of your life. Go ahead and check out Arena Club. All right, the big takeaways. I don't know how we fit this all into the middle segment of a 30-minute podcast, but looking at what's happened with the Mets so far, you talked about already, Ryan, how this kind of feels, I don't know if I want to say easier, but like you're used to this with how the wild card series went and feeling how close the Mets have been to elimination for games now. For the Phillies, well, this is dipping your toe back into the water of postseason baseball like we've experienced the past couple of seasons. But what have you learned more about this Mets team through 2 games against the Phillies that you already did not know in the first 3 games against the Brewers?
I feel really good about the top of the Mets lineup. And in a weird way, I'd almost say for the first time this season, which you might look at me like, man, they had a good offense all year, but they didn't have all those guys locked in at once. And particularly looking at what you've gotten from Lindor all year, that's been a given. But to see Vientos stepping up in this big moment, I mean, he's been unbelievable. Brandon Nimmo has had nothing but great at-bats in this series, and before that too, but in this series in particular, all of his at-bats, he's getting himself into good counts. He's hitting the ball hard almost every time. Obviously, he's going to hit into some outs too, but he's been really solid. And Pete Alonso, I feel like he really got the monkey off his back, hits a home run in game 2. But just in general, he hasn't been chasing as much this series as I've seen previously. So I feel really good about the top 4 in the Mets lineup, and that's really big. We talked about that in our first show together, how the Phillies had a real edge there with the top of their lineup. I don't think that Phillies edge has gone away. I mean, we saw it. One of my other takeaways, I'd say, from the other side of it is the Mets, if they're going to be this scared of Bryce Harper, they might not win this series. And I get being that scared of Bryce Harper, but I think a big turning point in game 2, Edwin Diaz came in, got out of that jam in the 7th inning, strikes out Schwarber, starts off the 8th inning, strikes out Trey Turner, and then just sort of bends to Bryce Harper in a game where the Mets had a 1-run lead with nobody on. I would have liked Edwin Diaz to go at Bryce Harper. If Harper ties the game, Harper ties the game, but he could hit a ball to the warning track and you get an out of it instead of putting a runner on and then leaving yourself open for a couple of hits from Castellanos and Stott to really turn that game. So that's a big thing for me when it comes to this series now, is how scared are the Mets of Bryce Harper, and what are they going to do to pitch to him late in games? Because Edwin Diaz is a card that you can pull once late in games. But as we saw, the lineup turned right back around to them, and it was McGill facing off against that top of the Phillies lineup. I talked about on my show today, Danny Young is the Mets' one lefty in the bullpen. He looked really shaky down the stretch, but he did face Harper 4 times this year and struck him out 3 times. So that's a big question for me is how do these teams get through the top of these orders? I really think we're setting up for a series where those groups at the top are really going to decide these games late.
Yeah, and a huge part of why the Phillies did not make it to the World Series last year was Bryce Harper did not have the protection he needed from the guy in the cleanup spot, which last season was Alec Bohm. And then Alec Bohm, weirdly, out of nowhere, gets benched ahead of Game 2. And word on the street is it could have been more emotionally based than performance-based, with him being a player that's been upset with his own performance. And when they talked about Edmundo Sosa getting the start at third base, the argument was energy. Now, I don't know about how things are handled in New York, but I would say that it's normally kind of weird to see an all-star starter at a position get benched one game into a postseason run for energy. But that's, I think, Rob Thompson's way of saying, hey, dude, you got to pull your head out of your in order to make sure that the rest of this lineup is not feeling your emotion from like getting out. We've seen that from Alec Bohm before. Of course, the infamous moment against the Athletics a couple seasons ago where he caught him yelling at the crowd and stuff like that. So that was interesting. But Nick Castellanos, like you said, he's been good protection for Bryce Harper. And at some point, if Castellanos is going to keep beating you, you got to pitch to Bryce Harper. But then he hits one halfway up the batter's eye. You can't win with this lineup, but you have to pick and choose your spots where you approach guys, and that's definitely something that's going to be difficult. For the Phillies, something that's weird. This bullpen implosion so far in the series has been insane. Jeff Hoffman was an all-star this year. He has an 81 ERA. Matt Strahm was an all-star this year. He has a 36 ERA. And I know it's a small sample size. It's 2 games. Those always are inflated numbers, but they've been owned by the Mets when you go to the bullpen. And that's part of the reason these games have been more dramatic than they necessarily have needed to, because you're seeing guys come in that were sub-2 ERAs over 162 games, a lot of innings, and then it's Mark Vientos being Barry Bonds and putting the ball out. It's Pete Alonso. It's everybody like putting together great at-bats against them. My thought is the bullpen's too good to look this bad for the whole series, but my thoughts in the Arizona series last year was this offense is too good to not look this bad, and you end up sitting on the couch. So that's something that I'm majorly worried about going forward. What's your biggest worry with the Mets so far?
It's the bullpen. So it's kind of the same thing. And I know from the Phillies side, they had a great bullpen in the first half, particularly. But I think some of those guys, you can correct me if I'm wrong, did kind of fade a little bit in the second half, like your all-stars there. So I do really wonder how they're going to perform. And then on the Mets side, I mean, it's been a question all year. And part of what I was discussing on how to attack Bryce Harper, it comes back to Edwin Diaz. I mean, they have put an incredible workload on him up to this point to just get here. Mm-hmm. Yes, I don't think there was ever any intention of Edwin Diaz getting all 7 outs. I think it was very much get the last out of the 7th, get through the 8th. But if you could have gone to a Danny Young to get Kyle Schwarber out the last out of the 7th and save Edwin Diaz, maybe you're getting a better version of him in that 8th inning. So the Mets need to find some other guys they can trust. And it's hard because they really haven't had a good bullpen this year. So I think the bullpens are going to play a huge role. And then I guess the other kind of, part that goes with it is the starting pitching, right? If you can get these guys deep in games, if Aaron Nola goes 8, I mean, all right, then the bullpen might only need to get 3 outs in game 3. So I think that's the other side of it. I think the starting pitching matchup in game 3 is going to be really interesting because it's Nola versus Manaea, 2 guys that could absolutely, be the best version of themselves and pitch really deep into a game and sort of get around that bullpen, which again, I think for both teams right now, the biggest weakness I've seen has been the bullpens.
Yeah, and I'd love to say the Phillies starting pitching has been the brightest spot from either team in this series, but I can't say that with the way that, not that Kodai Senga really counts as a guy who started the amount of innings he went, but Severino looked really solid. It's so weird how similar these teams' worries and strengths are through 2 games, but how worried both teams probably are about the series. And at the same time, how worried both teams are probably not about the series, because if you're the Mets, you stole a game and you're going back up to Citi Field. And if you're the Phillies, you think your offense has finally woke up in the postseason and you're ready to go. And who knows what's going to happen in games 3 and 4. I'm going to be honest. I don't think anybody does. But we're going to try and give our best shot at what is going to happen coming up as we wrap up today's episode. But let's talk about Booking.com, our title sponsor for today's episode. First, Booking.yeah. If you're looking to head up to New York and check out some of these games, you need a place to stay, you want to set up your trip, well, go ahead and check out Booking.com. They can make you a fan of any U.S. city, even your baseball rivals. Or maybe once everything's all said and done, we both hope that that's the end of October for our teams, maybe you want to take a trip elsewhere. You want to enjoy the offseason. Booking.com is not just for baseball trips. They got everything you need to make sure your next vacation is put together great. So whether you're a Mets fan coming down here to Philly for a potential Game 5, whether you're a Phillies fan going up to New York for games 3 and 4 and you need that accommodation, well, Booking.com has got you covered. So go ahead and check out the website, obviously, Booking.com. Go ahead and download the Booking.com app from the Google Play or App Store. You can find it anywhere. It's the number one place to find a way to book those vacations that you need, even if they're in your baseball rival's city. And let's also talk about FanDuel, because, man, if you think you know what's going on with this series, you're crazy. But if you think that Vegas knows what's going on with this series, you're also crazy. I don't think anyone knows. So this is a great time. If you got a feel on what's going on, check out FanDuel. Make some bets. Make some money on this. At least that kills some of the stress of it. Is if you had a one bet on over on hits or over on homers by the 3rd or 4th inning, it's possible. Plus, football is ongoing. You got college football, basketball, and hockey are getting going. Hockey starts this week. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Plus, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet on FanDuel and FanDuel.com. Go ahead and check it out. They are America's #1 sportsbook. Again, $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. All right, wrapping up this crossover episode with Ryan Finkelstein of Locked On Mets. And make sure, this is going to be one heck of a series, and we're not going to be able to do crossovers every day. So lock into Locked On Mets, hit that subscribe button, give a rate and review wherever you consume your podcast. You're going to want to hear it from both sides of this series, because honestly, it's absolutely amazing what's going on. And also go ahead and check out Locked On MLB. Thank you for making this your first listen every day. Locked On Mets, Locked On Phillies. We know you guys love these shows, but Locked On MLB, man, you're going to want to hear what's going on in the Dodgers-Padres series, what's going on over in the American League. There have been some wild games so far, so make that your next listen. Also part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right. What happens in New York? How confident are you, Ryan, in the Mets' ability to defend home field? And I'm going to guess that you don't want to see a Game 5 in Philadelphia with Zach Wheeler. So how confident are you in this team to win both games at home and wrap up the series before they have to get back on the road?
I think very similar to the sentiment I had going into the Philly part of this series. I think the Mets have to win this first game, Game 3. And I think they're going to have such a big emotional lift being back at home. It was 2 weeks ago that Pete Alonso played his last home game at Citi Field. That was the narrative. And Carlos Mendoza was pretty passionate after the game. Like, we're going to get back here. There was a lot of times where it looked at the Mets were not going to get back to Citi Field. So I think winning this Game 3 is so big for the Mets to be able to carry the momentum that their fans are going to bring into the ballpark, getting to see them live again for the first time in 2 weeks after these 2 weeks the Mets went through between a hurricane and the travel and getting in, and then Pete Alonso's home run. You know, he's going to get huge ovations every time he steps up to the plate. So I think for the Mets in particular, it's huge to win Game 3. I think the Phillies can drop Game 3, win Game 4, still win Game 5. And I think, of course, it can go the same way with the Mets. But having to win 2 back against their wall games, I think that's going to be a lot tougher for the Mets than the Phillies. The Phillies are battle-tested. They've done it before, and they know that they have Zach Wheeler in their back pocket for Game 5. I actually kind of a question I want to ask you. If the Phillies drop Game 3, are they going to think about using Wheeler in Game 4 on short rest, or would they still trust Ranger and the bullpen and whatever it is in an elimination game where you might not get back to Wheeler? How do you think the Phillies would play that?
Dude, it's an amazing question. And I've been thinking about that all day. And I don't know that they know how they'll handle it so far because Wheeler threw Saturday. So that's unbelievably short rest. But he's a guy that's complained about going on a day's worth of extra rest before. He likes to get out there. Now, I don't know if that's routine. I don't know if that's ready to roll. But you have to consider it with the season on the line. And at the same time, Ranger Suarez has been outstanding in the postseason for this team. And then he had a really rough second half and hasn't looked like that guy. So you don't really know. Are you getting the Ranger Suarez that looked like a Cy Young candidate through the first 3 months of the season? Or are you getting the guy who couldn't find his stuff for the last 2 months of it? And it's why Rob Thompson gets paid the amount of money that he does. I would assume that with their backs against the wall, they would probably still go with Ranger Suarez because what you start to look at in game 5 is a much less sure thing. You're going to go to, and Christopher Sanchez looked good, but you'd go to Sanchez on shorter rest than you expect to get that game 5 elimination game. And when you were thinking that maybe he could start the NLCS game 1 for you. So I think the easy answer is they would like to not have to get to that situation where elimination is game 4. But I would think they stay with Ranger Suarez because his track record in the postseason deserves faith, even though his regular season doesn't. And you have Zach Wheeler ready for emergencies out of the pen if you get later in that game and you need an inning or two. I don't know that that's the right answer, but I don't know that there is a right answer for that scenario. It's a great question, and it's something that's going to be really, really interesting to watch.
Now I'm thinking about sort of days off and everything. They would have Christopher Sanchez available to pitch that game 5 on regular rest.
Yeah, because it's Friday from Sunday.
Exactly. So what I would say is this is where game 3 is so pivotal. And I mean, that's obvious. We're in a 5-game series. Every game is pivotal. But whoever can, if this series does go 5, whoever wins game 3 might be able to survive the sort of war of attrition, getting to a game 5 where they don't have to exhaust everything in game 4. I think for both of these teams, the game 4 starter is a big coin flip if they're going to be on or not. With Ranger Suarez or Jose Quintana, it can either look really good and those guys can get you through 4 or 5 innings and get you into the later innings of the game feeling good, looking good. Or in the first inning, it might look horrible and you're pulling the ripcord quick. And I think that's a situation where from the Phillies side, you might have Zach Wheeler waiting just in case. And if you need him, you go to him to survive that game 4, knowing game 5, you'd have Sanchez and then maybe Nola on short rest out of the bullpen. So from the Mets side of it, their game 5, I think, is sort of like Kodai Senga is not going to impact game 4, but they might need to exhaust David Peterson in a game 4 to get to a game 5. And what made the Mets survive against Wheeler was having the combination of Senga and Peterson. So game 3, where both of these teams have a legit starting pitcher that can go deep into the game, I think game 3 is going to be a classic where I think it's going to be close. And then again, it's going to come down to the bullpens. Who's up when you get to that point? Who got the better start? You know, is it a 3-1 game, or did one of these starters have a bad start? And all of a sudden, if one of these teams can cruise to a victory, how is that going to change the series? But game 3, when you have Manaea versus Nola, that's the most interesting because that's the most clean-cut game I think we're going to get from this point on.
Yeah, and game 3 absolutely terrifies me. It has nothing to do with the players on the field or the pitcher on the mound or anything about that. Because we've seen in Philadelphia, people might kind of forget because the postseason become a regularity around here since this point. But when the Phillies found their way in 2022, they clinched on the road against Houston in the regular season, finished out the final 2 games of that series, and went directly to St. Louis, where they had a miraculous comeback in game 1 of the wild card series and knocked off the St. Louis Cardinals in 2 games. And then they went to Atlanta and they played 2 games down there and they split those 2 games. Is this starting to sound like anybody? And then they come back to Citizens Bank Park, and just having not seen the team in so long and having all those emotions built up, the bank was unbelievable. And game 3 of the NLDS that year, that was the Rhys Hoskins bat spike game. We all know how that ended. Like the emotion that's going to be at that ballpark, not just because it's a home playoff game and it matters so much, but what you were talking about. But Carlos Mendoza saying we're going to get it back there with this fan base thinking, hey, maybe we saw a beloved player in Pete Alonso his last at bat at Citi Field, and getting that opportunity to see this team again. It's going to be a crazy environment. And I'm just like, man, I've seen this movie from this side before. I know how tough of a spot it's going to be for the Phillies to play up there at Citi Field tomorrow and on Wednesday. It's going to be a madhouse, man.
It's going to be wild, man. I think that's again where I get back to it being such a big game for the Mets to get if they're going to win this series. And honestly, I look at Sean Manaea in particular. And this year, the Mets were 23-9 when Sean Manaea took the mound. And I think they won 15 of his last 18 starts. He absolutely became their ace down the stretch. But he had a rough start in Milwaukee when the Mets were trying to clinch. And then his playoff start, he was good, not great. Gave up a couple runs. They didn't have him go out there for a sixth inning that I think they probably should have pushed him for. What I'm looking at here is that first inning, right? If the Phillies go out and they hang a crooked number on Manaea in that first and take the crowd out of it, that's going to be big for the Mets. If Sean Manaea, goes and finishes the Phillies in order and strikes out Bryce Harper in that first inning, the crowd is going to be so in it when the Mets come up to bat and you see Lindor and Vientos and Nimmo and Alonso, all these guys that have had these moments away. Now they're going to come in. This is where all that momentum, all that energy, it's really going to boil to the surface early in that game. The Phillies are a team, though, that can absolutely rise to the moment and land that first punch. And that first punch, I think, would go a long way in that game.
Yeah, 100% will. And the one good thing about having Aaron Nola on the mound is he's a slow heartbeat guy that has been in these situations before. But that doesn't matter when at the end of 9 innings, if the scoreboard says the Mets win, you can be as calm as you want the whole time. Now, for the sake of the podcast, it would be great if we could do this again after 2 games in New York, another split, another couple dramatic games, and look at a game 5. But I'm sure you're hoping the Mets can finish things out without having to get back on a bus or a train. And I'm sure the Phillies are feeling the same way, that they don't want to have to exhaust everything to get to a game 5. So we'll see. We both made our arguments for why our teams can perform up at Citi Field, and we both made our arguments for why it could be a sticky situation. That's playoff baseball. We've seen it so far, but this has been an awesome series. You're not going to want to miss any of the content from this series. So make sure, again, you're checking out Ryan's work on Locked On Mets. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, rate and review wherever you consume your podcasts. We're both part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And please make sure you're doing the same for Locked On Phillies. I'd appreciate that. Hopefully we'll get a chance to do one of these again with the series still alive, but we may need to just do one of those decompress episodes after everything's all said and done, right? But through the first 2 games, well, no blood truly drawn yet, and yet home field advantage flipped. And we've got ourselves an absolute classic series to continue to watch. So it's been fun. And hopefully, again, we're doing another one of these on Thursday, talking about one of the biggest games in both of these teams' franchise history. But that's all for today's episode. Thank you so much for checking us out. And we'll both talk to you tomorrow on the next episodes of Locked On Phillies and Locked On Mets.